Ladies and gents, welcome to the Shroom Life podcast. Tonight, a bit of a different one. Usually I bring on a guest and we're talking about a species such as, kingfish or jewfish or whatnot. Today, we're bringing on a guest that's been on before and he's talked about kingfish. Eric Brandao is his name. And as we mentioned in the other introduction to that podcast, he's also an avid lure maker. And today, going to have a chat with him and see what he gets up to. And it is something that probably a lot of you guys that listen into the podcast have an interest in as well. So it's going to be a good conversation, and it's going to be my first one talking about this sort of thing. I actually haven't made any lures before, so it's going to be an incredibly enlightening experience. I'll let Eric introduce himself in a second and tell you more about himself, but so far, definitely he's that sort of offshore angler that chases your kingies, your marlin, chases jewfish sometimes as well, offshore jigging sort of style. And so that's the sort of person that he is. So let's welcome him to the podcast, to the Shroom Life podcast, Eric Brandao. How are you going, mate?
Good, thanks, Shroom. How's it going? It's been a while since I was on last, eh?
Feels like it. And I should probably mention to the viewers as well, if you can't find this podcast on the YouTube channel, it's on the main YouTube channel, or you can obviously look it up on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts as well. So look for Eric Brandao. Sydney Kingfish is the podcast name. But yeah, getting back to the question, Eric, it's been a crazy evening trying to get this podcast sorted.
Yeah.
I've got this echo of myself in my ear right now. So hopefully, guys, if I sort of like drag my E's and my vowels because I'm hearing myself twice, you guys know why.
I think technical difficulties are the mantra of the evening.
Absolutely. But luckily, it's not going to stop us getting started. So first things first, just a brief introduction about yourself. I've already talked about, the sort of fishing that you do. Would you like to expand a little bit on that?
So yeah, my name's Eric. I'm a avid fisher from Western Sydney, so I hail from Western Sydney. I think Shroom knows a lot of people from out west, but yeah, people from Sydney. It's not just the guys from the eastern suburbs and the northern beaches that love a bit of fishing. It's the boys out west love it too. But yeah, I basically love my kingy fishing. Kingy fishing is number one, and I'm primarily a lure fisher for kingies. I do a lot of vertical jigging, as you guys may or may not be aware. I'll absolutely froth the vertical jigging, and recently got into top water in over the last 5 years. So that was a bit of a crash course, and it basically I just kept developing the game to the point where I was like, man, why am I paying $300, $250 for a high end piece of timber from Japan? I looked at one day and went, I could probably make one of them. And it took a while, but I think I'm at that point now where I'm like, you know what? I can call myself a lure maker. So I wasn't the handiest guy. I'm a bit of a nerd. I'm one of those white collar workers that work in an office. So it was a long road ahead. I had a few accidents and it was a steep learning curve. I didn't even know what a bandsaw was or how to cut timber, but it all just it all just got put together as I was working along, and I learned along the way. And thankfully, I had a lot of mates that were really good tradies that gave me a helping hand as to what to buy, and a lot of forums online said like a lot of things that I learned about timber and timber densities, and now I can thankfully call myself a lure craftsman, I guess.
I think so. I think just hearing a little bit about lure making there, a bandsaw, I don't even think I know what that is at this stage. So I'm really looking forward to understanding a little bit more about it in this podcast. So
Yeah.
$300 lures, as you said,
Yep.
that's the price of I guess, an
Look,
intermediately priced rod or a pretty decently priced reel. So you're throwing that every cast out into the water.
I think what the appeal is it gives the angler a sensation of gambling. Okay, so this is I've sort of thought long and hard about this, and I think about this when I'm carving my lures, and I pinch myself thinking, I can't believe people are paying big bucks for handmade lures. Mine aren't worth $300 unless it's a limited edition run or something that's full abalone. But there are brands out there, and I'll just name a few from Japan, like Carpenter. A Carpenter bluefish is just worth a bomb. You're paying minimum 250 and upwards of 250 for a beautiful Japanese piece of timber, and it really does give an angler a sensation of gambling. So if you've gone out and you've bought $1,000 rod and you've bought $1,000 or $1,300 reel, and you've got $120 worth of line on there,
Yeah.
it probably makes sense to go, you know what, I may as well go all the way out and chuck a really expensive cool piece of timber, and it gives you that sensation of gambling. It's almost likened to slapping the pokies, you know what I mean? It probably gives that same sensation. But one thing I will say is when the fish are on, they will eat a really cheap lure. There's no difference when the fish are biting, they will whack anything. It's when the fishing is really, really, really hard, and the fish have seen a lot of lures like Sydney, a lot of the places up and down the coast, like up near Yeppoon,
Yep.
where GT fishing has just taken off. Some of these GTs are literally seen hundreds, if not thousands, of lures. When you've got that piece of timber in your lure bag that these fish haven't seen, and they've got a unique swimming action because they're handmade, that's a little ace in the hole, and that's the sort of lure that will get the bite on a hard day. So
Right.
that's where the appeal comes to a handmade lure for what I make. Like I said, if you're going somewhere no one's ever been in 6 months, like somewhere in the Coral Sea, like Cato or Wreck Reef, mate, something about $20 will catch you just as many fish. But it's those hard pressed fisheries that see a lot of lures thrown at them. The fish have seen a lot of lures, and kingfish in particular. I'm telling you, they're kingfish are fussier than a hot looking woman. I'm telling you. And anyone that fishes top water kingies will attest to this. They'll eat jigs all day, they'll eat liveys all day, but mate, you can be casting stick baits around and you will get about 50 sniffs before one commits. They are so fussy. And I'll tell you
Yep.
something, if the lure you've got catches a fussy old kingfish, they will catch any top water. They will catch any fish caught on top water in the world. That's
Right.
one thing I'll say.
That's a good viewpoint there. But getting back to, like you said, a lot of these handmade stick baits, like, the carpenter ones that you've said, they have limited releases. When they get into Australia, you can't stock up.
No, you can't. Like, look,
Not that I would try to stock up on them, but, you know.
it's like Matchbox cars. Like, one thing I'll say is when you start making lures, is lure collectors absolutely love you. Like, I've got, I know a lot of guys there that have got like close to 30 or 40 carpenters hanging on their wall, and like they get every limited edition run, and it's like Matchbox cars for them, really.
Yeah.
But like for me, look, I've got a bit of a collection of some handmade lures. Like it used to be, I want a few Japanese ones, but now I'm also collecting Australian lures that are made in Australia.
Yep.
Um, but like they're just super cool when you get something. Oh, someone's actually handmade this, and when you got this little collection, it's just like, wow, look at this. But I've got a little like I've got a little thing like if I've got a collector's item lure,
Yep.
I won't hang it on the wall until I catch a fish on it, because a lot of my lures actually hanging on people's walls, and I don't think they'll ever see salt water or fresh water at all.
Yep.
But that's just one of those things. It's when you make pretty pieces of timber, people love collecting them and looking at them. It's
Well,
just like,
yeah, I guess handmade objects have inherent value. I know just looking through Facebook, classified, you see a lot of people collect the really old handmade cod lures or
oh
bass
yeah, cod
lures.
lures is another market in its own. Like there's some really good, like one thing I'll say is Australia has really got some of the best handmade garage lure makers in the world. Some of the things that come out of Aussie garages, like through my lure making network, unbelievable. Like I
Yeah.
used to hold the Japanese in the highest esteem for the best lure makers in the world. And I don't think that's true anymore. I think Australia is probably underappreciated for the lures that come from our country. Like there's a lure making expo up. I think it's at Tamworth, and I see obviously follow it on socials. Some of the things that some people can like hand make, like you look at some of the things that like I'll name some lure makers that I really appreciate and really like what they do, like Nutterjack lures. a lot of his nut like lures for cod aren't even painted. They're actually like either just foiled and then they're toasted over the top to give it a bit of a burnt look, so it's counter shaded. They're
Right.
clear coated, they're screw eyed together, and then they're ready, and they just look gorgeous. Like, and they slay too. They catch heaps of fish. There's JJ Plagues is another guy. I think Greg Vinals actually interviewed him, and he makes some really nice dew lures, like swim baits and all that sort of stuff. And you don't see lures like that come out of Japan. Not for our fishery, you know what I mean? I just feel that we have some fussy fish here, and the hand-made lures that come out of Australia have to be up there with the best in the world. There's some
Right.
really good there's some really good handmade if you're into your top water fishing. Like I'd make top water lures. That's my jam because I started off jigging and the natural progression into top water fishing was just there for me. But it just got to a point where I'm like, oh, you know what? I can't afford these expensive lures anymore. I might make them for myself. And I started making them, and people were like, oh, can you make me one, bro? And can you make me one, bro? It's turned into a 6 week constant back order for the last year and a half. You know what I mean?
Wow, that's
But
amazing.
there's some really good handmade lures that come out of Indonesia as well. And I think Indonesia and Vietnam, there's some really good like lure makers out of there. And sometimes I don't understand why they don't cost as much as a lure that comes out of Japan. A lot of there's a bit of a debate as to what makes a handmade lure. For me, a handmade lure is not made on a CNC machine by a computer and a copy lathe. It has to be hand carved.
Right.
So you can either have a piece of timber that you've made hand carved one and it's getting copied by a machine and CNC'd out, or you can do what I do. For example, I've got paper stencils. I draw them out on timber and I hand carve them with a handheld file sander. I used to use a razor, but I had a bit of an accident. I still can't feel my pinky. Not my pinky, my pointer. So
Yep.
for me, a handmade lure is literally in your hand and hand shaped all the way to the end where it's hand coated, hand painted. None of it's done by a machine. Even the through wires, for example, that I make for my lures are all hand bent. Even my eyes are handmade. So for me, as soon as you hear the word CNC, I don't think it might be hand painted and hand finished, but it's definitely not a handmade lure anymore. And the whole point of having a timber lure that's handmade is no two are the same. So
Right.
pressured fishery, you want one that actually has a unique swimming action. You're less likely to get a unique swimming action from a CNC lure because it's they're all the same. They're all the same shape. The only difference is going to be the density in the timber. They can argue that no two pieces of timber are the same because of the density, but still, I don't think that's considered handmade. So
Yeah.
I didn't understand this until I really started into the lure making world. And a lot of lures I thought were handmade actually aren't. They're actually CNC cut.
I
So
see. Yeah.
that's where I think, I'll tell you straight up, there's some really good. I'll tell you some really good handmade uh, top water lures from Australia. Look, for me, right, it's not a competition with people. Everyone goes, oh, look, isn't someone your competitor? For me, no. Like, for example, right, do you only own one brand of soft plastic in your box room? If you weren't, like, for example,
Well, I wouldn't, but yeah,
no,
you're
you
right.
wouldn't.
No one would.
No one would. Okay, so if you've got one of my lures in your back, my lures sit next to many different Australian lure makers' lures in people's bags, right? And
Yep.
I'll mouth off a few really good lure makers that make top water lures in Australia. I reckon number one, okay, I reckon Johnny Pace from Pacemaker Lures. He's top water lures are number one in Australia. I think he's the gold standard. There's some really, really nice lures that come out of Sydney by a guy called Griff Lures. He's a raw timber handmade as well. And then you'll get a guy called Nashies. Now, Nashies aren't timber lures, they're actually resin. So they are handmade, they're hand poured, but they're out of a mold made from resin.
Yep.
Resin, you get a slightly different action from timber. I've thought about mucking around with resin, but I'm a timber lure maker, so I stick to timber. And look, out of Sydney, there's another guy called Jason Tran. He makes from Untamed Lures. He makes beautiful stick baits. Some of the stick baits I've seen him make, and they slay too.
Like I've seen them hanging out of like big kingies, heaps of yellowfin, and when you see a lure catching big kingfish over a meter, you know that thing catches fish because big kingfish
Right.
over a meter are like they are the Mona Lisa of the top water world. They are the hardest things to catch.
Yeah,
So
that makes sense.
Yeah,
But
like
yeah, I was gonna give you the perspective of someone that's not well into the the lure making sort of
yeah,
understanding of the scene. So maybe I represent someone that doesn't really understand it at
yeah,
all that much. When someone says handmade, to me, it's that definition that you said where they hand carved it and they
absolutely.
hand sanded it.
Yep,
They've put it in the pool to test it.
yep.
They might have refined it after that, and then they've got their hand and they painted it themselves.
That's exactly right. That's the definition for me, and what I would commonly, even if I wasn't a lure maker, that's what I would consider handmade.
Yeah,
So that's and that's where it's sort of it gets a bit contentious and people get a bit argumentative. Oh no, mine are still handmade because they're still hand painted, but it's really it isn't. You know what I mean?
that's right.
Um,
It's like these days when you look at the back of some electronic device like a phone and it says designed in California, manufactured elsewhere. It's that grey line where you can sort of claim, a certain place, or you know what I'm talking about. It's
yeah,
it's a
yeah,
bit
that's
like that.
exactly right. So like yeah, like I said, it's not it's I'm not saying people that are CNC cutting lures are misleading people. It's just one of those things, and there's a place in everyone's tackle box for all these different lures. Like I'm not saying that handmade lures are the best. It's their handmade lures are good when the fishing's hard. But when the fishing's easy and there's fish everywhere and they're biting, mate, you can go into BCF or Anaconda and pick up a Nomad lure. Those stick baits will catch just as many as what my ones would, for example, you know what I mean,
Yeah,
or anyone else's if the fishing's hard, good. It's when the fishing's hard is
yeah,
when that's when you want a couple of handmade lures in your box, and you can't just have one. You know what I mean? Like if there's
yeah,
heaps of Spanish mackerel getting around that are snipping your lures, you're not going to go like I wouldn't go cast a $200-300 lure around when you can go cast a plastic one that probably costs you $20 to $30, and if
that
you
would be
lose it, it
gambling.
doesn't hurt as much. You know what I
That
mean?
would be gambling, Eric.
Yeah, and then you get times where look, you're on the coral reef, for example, and they're the Great Barrier Reef, and there are GTs on tap. I'm talking a cast, mate. A timber lure, you after 10 GTs, you're going to have some massive indentations on that lure, and you know what?
Yeah,
It would still work and everything. It's not going to be pretty at the end of it. I don't care how good your epoxy finish is, it's going to get munched. That's where things like resin lures come into play. Like if you look at there's a brand that a lot of the YouTubers plug called FCL Labo. They
yeah,
make a range of resin lures similar to Nashi's but made in Japan. And they're not cheap, but they're around that $50 to $60 range. They're quite well finished and they swim really well. They're a really tough lure, and when you're getting those days where the fish are just piling in, they last a lot longer because they're resin. They can have 5-6 chunks taken out of them and they're still going to swim. Where a timber one, you're probably going to get a few holes in it and it's really going to get bashed. And
yeah,
a plastic one, you're probably going to get it crunched to the point it starts sucking in water and sinking.
yeah,
So you have to have you got to have the right tool for the job when it's hard, and you go, oh, I'm not getting a lot of bites here. I'm getting a lot of follows and not a lot of hits. That's when you pull out the creme de la creme timber handmade lures. So
yeah. It makes sense.
there's a time and a place for all these things.
I think it's when you're desperate. You really want to
Yeah,
get that fish, do or die. You want that hook up, and you'll deal
yeah.
with the consequences afterward.
Oh, that's exactly right. But I'll tell you a bit of a story how I started lure making, and I wasn't like I said earlier, I wasn't the handiest guy. I'm not a tradesman or anything. I'm a nerd,
Right.
as most people would know.
Well,
Um,
it's hard to notice these things. Actually, I'd
yeah.
say most people wouldn't have thought that.
And like you look at, like I basically looked at, these timber lures going, oh, I could probably make them, right? Like I said earlier. But I sort of never found time to sit down and work out how I was going to do it. And look, living out in Western Sydney, the second lockdown just absolutely flogged us. So no fishing, no lifting weights, it was nothing. So it sort of took me back a couple of steps going, what can I do at home? And I really started researching, to maybe make a few lures. And I
Yep.
actually messaged Greg Vinyl. I was like, oh, look, what sort of timber do you make lures with? And he mentioned the two timbers, jelly tong and Western red cedar. And at that time, I could not leave 5Ks from my front door. And 4.9 kilometers I lived with my parents back then. 4.9 kilometers from my parents' front door, there was a timber mill in St Mary's that sold Western red cedar and jelly tong. So it was the
Right.
beginning of the end. So I went all in. I bought all this timber, did the research. I bought the tools to do the job. I started carving with a Stanley knife. I bought a bandsaw. I bought a really cheap Ozito airbrush from Bunnings, and I couldn't get like all these fancy airbrush paints from like called Createx and that. I just was nowhere near home, and I didn't want to go buy them online because I didn't want to look at the colours. And I've got a white card, so I could go into Bunnings. I started
Right.
buying paints from Bunnings, thinning them down, and learning all this at home. And they were all pretty rough at the start, and they just slowly got better. And like I spent literally weeks getting my first lures to swim right. And thankfully, my parents had a pool in the backyard, so I'd
Yep.
carve out a shape. I'd draw out the shape from scratch with a French curve, and I started mucking around with weight placement. And, oh yeah, that's got not enough action, or this one's tilting to the side a little bit. And I started mucking around with the lead weights, and
Yep.
I basically designed my first lure, and that one was called the Instaho, and that's that one. So that's the first timber lure I ever made.
Nice.
Um, I think I made about 15 of these. So there's about 15 of them getting around, and they're pretty rough, eh? I look at them every now and then when the guys come out fishing with me, and I sort of cringe. They all swim mad, but the finish on them were just nowhere near to what they are now. So the Instaho, which is 100, what was 155 mil stick bait, I designed it on the profile of a yakka. So most common bait fish out of Sydney is a yakka. Kingies love them. So I designed a floating stick bait that was 155 mil, which is the exact size of the average size yakka, and I went from there. And basically from there, I went, hang on, what's your favorite lure to fish for kingfish? And I thought to myself, a jig. So I designed a stick bait that had that jig profile, long and skinny. And I noticed when I started topwater fishing, not a lot of the lures that were getting sold were designed for kingfish, not the
Yep.
ones that were commonly obtainable. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, there's plenty of Japanese ones that you have to look far and wide that are designed for their hiramasa, which is our kingfish, but not a lot of them were readily available. So I was like, I drew up a long, skinny stick bait that was designed to be like a slimy, soury garfish sort of thing. And I basically carved my first one out and went, oh, this would be a mad kingfish lure. And the first one was a flop. I just could not get it to swim in the pool.
Yep.
So that went in the bin. And the next shape I drew out and carved out was a winner. It swam straight away, rear-ended, and that is my best-selling stick bait for everything, and that's the one that catches all the fish at the moment. It's called a longho, but this is the first one I ever made, and that's out of jelly tong. So
Yep.
that's 200 mil, and I designed this specifically for kingfish and yellowfin. Still to this day, no one's caught a yellowfin on it. It's not that they wouldn't catch a yellowfin. It's they've never been cast at one. I
Right.
totally missed last year. I could not get in front of a yellowfin because of the weather. So and that's it. hopefully I get a go this season. But they've
Yeah,
been
that'd be the
slaying.
plan for this season.
Yeah, they've been slaying the kingies. A couple of guys down in SA have been catching some pretty big meter 30 kingies on them. And I
Yep.
didn't design them for GTs, but they have been. I've caught a couple of good GTs on them. And mate, up north they've been catching heaps of GTs on them, and I didn't even design them for GTs. I thought they were a bit too small for a GT lure. But I went from a bit of an evolvement from this. It's still got the same shape, but I've changed things around. So I had issues with the lure sinking because we don't have glass outs here out of Sydney and our area. That it's generally quite choppy. A floating stick bait needs to have a little bit of weight so it actually dives under the water and swims. A lot of the
Yep.
high-end Japanese lures are really, really, really hard to swim. And if you don't have your technique down pat, you got Buckley's trying to get that thing to swim. So with my lures, I designed them to actually swim in choppier conditions. But the jelly tong with the jelly tong timber I was using, they were sinking when I was putting on more coats of epoxy, and I'm going, oh, I've got to go back to the drawing board here. Like, what's going on here? So I did my
Yep.
reading, and I discovered not discovered, but I found out about a timber called Polonia, and that timber has just been a life changer for me. And one thing I'll say, it's all grown in Australia, the stuff I use, and it
Yep.
is majority of what Japanese lure makers use. It's
Ah,
so
right.
buoyant. It's almost unsinkable. Like you can pack the thing full of lead and they still float. And that's what all my floating lures are made from a timber called Polonia. One thing I wasn't happy with using jelly tong is it's actually been cut out of rainforests in Indonesia, so it's really adding to deforestation, which I wasn't a big fan of. So my Polonia is all Australian plantation grown, and it's actually carbon. It's a really good carbon fixing tree, so it
Yep.
offsets a lot of carbon. So I'm pretty happy that it's having a bit of an environmentally sustainability sort
Yep.
of thing along with it. So I feel really comfortable about that. And it's an Australian mill, so it's all coming out of Australia. It's up at Coffs Harbour, so I drive up to Coffs Harbour every year to get my 10 linear meters of Polonia. But it's got awesome properties, like it's really, really strong timber for how light it is, and it does not absorb water like other timbers and is not prone to rotting. It's used to make surfboards. It's
Yep.
used to build boats, and it's not as toxic as what other timbers like cedar. Like red cedar is really good, but like it's so hazardous to work with. Like I
Oh, right.
remember,
Yeah.
yeah, the sawdust from cedar. It's like, yeah, you got to wear a respirator. I wear respirators anyway, but yeah, it's at least a little bit safer. And the
Yeah.
action, I more importantly, the action I get from Polonia timber because of how buoyant it is. It's erratic like no other, and action when it comes to kingfish lures is number one.
Yeah.
So
Look, I didn't want to interrupt you because that was all like really invigorating and
yeah,
stimulating stuff. But let's just go back and talk about the three woods that you
yeah,
mentioned, which was red cedar,
yep,
Polonia, and
jelly
um,
tongue.
jelly tongue. That's the
Yeah.
one. Like, for someone that wants to get into making some lures,
Yep.
that's probably going to be the three choices that they
Yeah.
have.
100%.
How would you quickly like summarize their properties for someone that's starting out?
So the easiest to work with out of the three is jelly tongue, and it's probably the easiest to find, and it's the cheapest. Okay. So
Yep.
say for example, if you've got a timber mill locally, they all should have jelly tongue. Western red cedar is pretty easy to find too, but the original linear meter I bought for $30 during COVID. I went to go price up the same linear meter of that, $150 now.
Wow.
So yeah, if I was
What
to
happened there?
import, it's all imported from Canada.
Yep.
So yeah, it's expensive. Um, Mind you, if you were to get a linear meter of, if you were to make all those lures you'd make out of that linear meter, if you wanted to make little jackal, like those little vibes and little crankbaits and stuff, you'd be saving that, because if you were to buy those things for like those little jackals and stuff for $30 a piece, you'd probably be okay. But yeah, look,
Yep.
if you were going to start lure making tomorrow, I would, yeah, be looking at Polonia's good, but you got to actually buy it online, and you got to actually buy a fair bit of it to make postage worth it. Like minimum postage is $150 for Polonia, so you have
Right.
to actually
Okay.
buy a fair bit of it.
Yeah.
But if you went into, say, a timber mill, and you went, can I have a linear meter jelly tong? That linear meter would cost you, $30. So it's one of those things, and you can get a lot of lures out of there. And jelly tong, look, if you're not selling lures and you're just making them for yourself, it's fine, as long as you can accept the fact that as soon as your clear coat goes, it's going to start sucking in water, and it might be time to retire it. It's
Yep.
fine. It's the same issue I had. Like some of my original jelly tong lures, as soon as they get munched, it does absorb water. It's basically balsa wood, pretty much. It's heavy
Yeah.
duty balsa wood jelly tong.
Yeah,
But
because I was just about to ask you about, the properties, how they
yeah,
differ. So jelly tong's the least long
least water
lasting
resist, long lasting, but the easiest to carve. So
and the
if you
cheapest
and
to,
the
or
cheapest, if
the
you've got
cheapest to
minimal
acquire.
tools, if you've got pliers, you've got some wire, you've got some araldite, and you've got a handsaw,
Yeah.
you can make a lure. You know what I mean? It's not hard. Um, that's the thing. So jelly tong would be the easiest one, and that's what most Aussie lure makers use because it's so readily available. So most of your timber cod lures that are mass produced by CNC are most probably all jelly tong. So,
Yeah.
but yeah, Western red seed is good too. You can actually special order it from Bunnings, but you will pay a premium price for it.
Right. So
Um,
this one costs, a little bit more.
Costs a little bit more, yeah. So yeah, but if you were to make lures tomorrow, mate, jelly tong, can't go wrong. Like honestly, it is really, really easy to work with. You don't need any power tools to work it. It's really a pleasure to carve.
Yep.
Yeah.
And what
So
about the positives of using red cedar?
red cedar is basically a boat building timber, and it's rated to go on even with no treatment. It's actually rated to be underwater for 20 years without any rot.
Oh,
So
wow.
it's got a lot of arsenic in its actual, like in the timber itself. It's got a lot of arsenic, and there's
Yep.
a lot of nasty stuff in there. But it's a natural preservative at the end of the day. It's not going to start rotting. So um, a lot of big game lures, top water lures, like Pacemaker, for example, he uses Western red cedar.
Yep.
But when you've been in the game that long, you can name your price for your lure, so you can justify $150 for a lump of Western red cedar. But it
Yep.
is like honestly, if I was to pick one lure, one bit of timber to use forever, it would be Western red cedar. It is the best lure making timber on the planet.
Yep.
Um, Polonia just seems to, for top water lures, and more so kingfish and tuna lures where they don't get bashed up as much.
Yep.
I think Polonia just has the edge just for that buoyancy, especially with thinner profiles. If you're making fatter profiles, it's fine, but Western red cedar seems to be a little bit denser, so it's little bit more resistant to like things like GTs.
Yep.
But like my lures, because I live in Sydney, my lures are mainly kingfish and yellowfin lure and tuna lures, but they do catch GTs as well. So I focus on that kingfish and yellowfin fishery. Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. So basically, you've got the cheap option now with
Yeah.
the jelly tong. Keep
Yeah.
getting tongue tied with that name there. Then you've got probably, I guess, the gold standard. You would say the Western
Yeah.
red cedar, but
Western
you're
red
paying a
seed is the
big.
gold standard.
You're paying a lot for it. It's gonna
Yeah.
last. It's
Yeah.
so good that they're even gonna use it, in the hulls of boats, which tells
Yeah.
you that that's super buoyant
Yeah.
and solid.
Yeah.
And you've also used Polonia because of
Polonia
that
is my number
extra
one.
buoyancy, and
Yeah.
so it's got a property that the
Yeah.
others don't have.
Yeah. So, and the thing is too, like the reason why I would say Western red cedar would be the best lure making timber, even though I don't use it, is you can also use, you don't have to put as much lead in it if you want a sinking lure. So if you want to make a crankbait that suspends or sinks, you don't
Yep.
have to put as much lead in it. Polonia, you pretty much need to like open up your bag of sinkers and just pour it in there to try and get it to sink. You know what I mean? I'm
Fair
sure if
enough.
you're
Yeah.
better at maths, you'd be able to work out some mathematical equation. But yeah, I'm pretty rough with that sort of stuff.
Yeah, I mean,
So
do people think about ballast at all? I mean, I'm just thinking about some totally unrelated concept,
yeah,
possibly, and sport. I'm thinking about Formula One.
yeah,
Now, what they have is they've got a minimum weight for the cars, and if they're below that, they have to weight it back up
yeah,
to meet the limit. And the advantage of that is if they're too light, they get to put the weight down low, which improves the center of gravity and balance of the car. So I'm wondering for these lures here, where you're adding the weight, so you've got Western Red Cedar, which is already naturally more dense and more
yep,
solid, so you need less lead,
yep.
but you have that option with the Polonia to distribute it
Oh,
in the way that you
absolutely,
want.
yeah, yeah. And like I said, look, it's pretty much most Western lure makers that aren't in Japan are all using Western Red Cedar, like the original Rapalas, that those CD9s and stuff from back in the 90s and 80s,
Yep,
all Western Red Cedar. So any of those American handmade lures that come out of America in the early days were all pretty much, yeah, all those original Rapalas are all Western Red Cedar.
yep,
OTL, I forgot to mention, there's some great lure makers in New Zealand, NACL and OTL. You see a fair few of them online.
yep,
They're so NACL are Polonia and OTL are made out of Western Red Cedar. So they're both Kingfish lures, and they do seem to catch GTs as well. So same sort of concept. But one thing I'll say with Polonia, because it's grown in Australia, it just adds to my handmade lures made in Australia from an Australian product. That's another plus for me.
right,
So it's supporting an Australian business. You know what I mean?
yep. Now, you also mentioned earlier another material.
Yep.
Well, I guess it's not really. I
Resin.
mean, it is a material, but it's a living material. Oh, yeah, that's
Yeah.
right. You've mentioned resin. Let's
Yep.
talk about that. But I was gonna mention abalone.
Yes. Yes.
So that's
So
two additional materials. So we'll go through each of them.
yeah. Okay. So I've recently, over the last 6 months, I've been mucking around with a lot of abalone, so Jap spec abalone patterns on my lures, and it look, it isn't the easiest thing to do, and the abalone sheets that you get from New Zealand or Japan are pretty hard to source. So that's why they do get a premium product. So like for example, I made an abalone 150 mil abalone lure, and like it had a price of like $160 or something like that. And I sold it to a guy too, and I've
Yep.
just like I look at that and went, oh my god, like I can't believe someone just spent that much for one of my lures. But when I look at it, the abalone just really does make things pop. Like it is a living thing, and it's another living thing to add to. It was a living thing that is stuck to the timber that was once living as well, and it adds to that coolness and the reflective properties of abalone is just so cool. Like and look, I don't like just randomly make them. Like if someone says to me, "Oh man, can you craft me an abalone lure?" I'm not going to say no. You know what I mean? I just love
Yep.
making them, and it's a challenge as a lure maker. Like you can spray the same colorways all the time, but it gets boring. So when you got these challenges as a lure maker, it's cool. So, for example, I'll show you. I don't know if you can see, but that's my original Longho 150 that I designed for Sydney. So that's a 150 mil floating stick bait. That's the
Yep.
original prototype, and that was out of Jellytong. So I basically that was the first one, and 30 of them later, this is the full abalone one. So
Right.
that one there, someone's paid for. Owen's actually bought this one, and this one is actually white abalone, if you can see, and I've actually faded some like a blue and black Sauri pattern over the top, and
Yep.
I've now got 3D eyes, which I make as well. So it's just really really cool. Like, and I can guarantee you, if you cast this off the rocks of Sydney, Mr. Kingfish has never seen one. So you know what I mean? It's cool.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I never really understood what abalone meant. So it's sort of like a coating
Yeah,
or like
no,
a shell.
it's basically a veneer. So you look at the Kiwis call them pawa, and they're basically a shellfish. And when you eat the abalone out of there, they've got like the shiny stuff in like inside the shell. So what they do is they remove that pearlescent stuff out of the shell, and then they turn it into a veneer sheet, and then I can manipulate that sheet to fit on a lure.
Oh, that's
So it's a
cool.
bit of a process, and it's
Yeah.
very time consuming.
Yep.
It's very very laborious, but the end results are just cool. You know what I mean? It's one of those things I could never afford abalone lures myself, especially running a boat. I was like, oh man, I just can't afford an abalone lure, and it's for me, it's like a big achievement to go, man, I'm making abalone lures now. So it's pretty cool in that sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what about resin?
So okay, resin, like obviously there's resin lures now, and look, you like resin lures are one of those things. It's basically, so I use a an epoxy resin clear coat. So these things rotate for close to 3 days to do the clear coat over the paint. So the resin lures are actually, that clear coat is the whole lure pretty much. So
Yep.
they add little glass balloons to it to make it float to get the right buoyancy. So you can get the buoyancy of Polonia from resin if you get the ratio of resin and glass balloons right. And then it
Yep.
comes out of a mold, and then you paint it exactly like any other lure. You know what I mean?
Yep.
But yeah, the most for an aesthetic standpoint and a toughness standpoint, if a lure was basically timber like this, it's a Longho 200 that it's ready to be carved and through wired.
Yep.
Even though Polonia's got properties that, it can withstand a lot of water, and it doesn't absorb water like other timbers, it still does absorb water. I've done the tests. If you don't put an epoxy clear coat or a 2-pack clear coat on it or seal the timber, it will eventually start sinking because it starts sucking in all the water. And when it's bashed by multiple fish, it starts opening up and letting out water, and you have to let it dry out. So it's very, very important to seal your lures with some sort of epoxy resin. So or 2-pack, which they do cars in. But I use epoxy resin, and
Yep.
it finishes the lure and gives it that professional look. You know what I mean? And it hardens it. So if you tap it onto timber, it still feels pretty soft. After you've sealed it with epoxy resin, it's just like glass. Like to the if I went and handed this to someone and said it was plastic, they'd probably go, "Oh yeah, it's plastic," but really it's timber.
Yep.
So it gives it that toughness, and it gives it a bit more durability when it gets bashed by a lot of big fish.
Now, this is probably the wrong time to ask this question. I probably should have asked this straight at the start. But say you've got your wood after an hour of podcast now that we've gone through. How do we start carving
So
something?
basically, before you even carve, you should have drawn out a shape. So you've got a shape in your mind. I use things like what they call a French curve. It's in the room there, but it's basically curves, so you can draw curves. So you can draw exactly what you want. Okay, so say for example, okay, I'll use this for example. I'll let out a bit of a secret. I'm currently designing a lipless crankbait for Deweys. All right, so that's the
Yep.
first one I've ever made out. So I drew out this pattern from scratch on a French curve. You draw that on a piece of paper, you cut that out, you you template that onto a piece of timber, and you either cut it out with a saw, carve it out with a knife, or I cut it on the bandsaw. You cut the shape out, then you need to experiment with where you put your weights. So you can either make 100 prototypes and actually put the lead in, or you can get lead and just hot glue gun it to the bottom of the lure, and you experiment with where you hang your hooks and everything. And once you got in a pool or
Yep.
at a lake or something, you work out if once you got how to get your swimming action right and tuning it. Once you've done that, that's the easy part. Getting a lure to swim is the easy part. The painting and all the artwork and the clear coat is
Oh,
just,
interesting.
that is the hard part of lure making.
I really thought that designing it from scratch would have been pretty difficult and frustrating.
My Longho 200 is still the same, is still weighted the same from my original. They swam good from day dot.
Yeah.
The only additions was the extra buoyancy from Polonia and the finish. So if you look at that's my original Longho. So the shape is still the same as this one. The
Yeah.
epoxy resin's a different brand now, and it's a different timber. It went from that to that. So that's basically I started mucking around with foils. This has got an abalone fin and it's just got foil eyes. So this
Yeah.
one here's been bashed by a few GTs. So I've gone from that. I've then progressed to making ones with 3D eyes. So that's got a resin eye that I make. So that's a coral trout one. And this is a little bit of these are a little assist hooks that I've been mucking around with. And I couldn't get these to swim with assist hooks, but I've made up ones to get them to actually swim now. That's another, we'll talk about that later when we talk about stick baiting kingies and stuff and why I do that.
Yeah.
But yeah, now I've gone and progressed to things like 3D eyes. This one here was a bit of a knock-up one, an ugly one that the eyes were a bit crooked, so I kept it for myself. 3D eyes, full foil body, faded and everything. And I experimented with putting a bit more weight on this one. So my personal ones are all just the B grade ones that I made, and went, oh, I wonder what it swim like with a bit more weight. So that's how I basically tune my lures. I hammer a few sinkers flat, and I glue it to the bottom, and I go to the park and I just basically tune them, swim them, and take the glue gun, and I basically just move the weights back and forward until I get the desired swimming action. So
Yeah.
that's that's what they sort of look like now. But I haven't got any of my really pretty ones; they're all gone. My own personal ones are actually unpainted, so
I see. Yeah.
I actually don't paint my own lures. Like I either spray paint them black or I spray paint them white, and I'm pretty comfortable and confident to use them even if they're not painted. So I don't. I think paint jobs are just one of those things, and I shouldn't say this as a lure maker, but I think paint jobs are one of those things that it just really does catch the angler. Like I know
Right.
that sounds a bit strange because I really do put a lot of artwork into my lures, but it really just is to catch the angler. It's the profile and contrast that really gets fish to bite. So if you're thinking about making lures for yourself and you go, oh geez, I can't spray paint that, that's going to look, mate. Even that bare timber will still catch just as many fish as something pretty like that. So um, yeah, that's one thing. And like a lot of lure makers are probably sitting there going, oh, why did he say that? But it's the truth. You know what I mean? And it's all about confidence. If you're confident in what you're casting with any fish sort of fishing,
Yeah.
bream, kingies, marlin, if you're confident, it's going to work. That's the way I look at it.
Yeah. That's interesting. Color is always a concept that we revisit on the podcast ever so often. In when guests either proclaim that it matters and it's be all and end all, and there are some that don't really have a preference. And I guess it also depends on the style of fishing that they're doing as well.
Yeah, nah. So like and yeah, like I said, like it's the easy bit is actually getting it to swim right. The hard bit is actually getting the finish right. Like for example, epoxy resin, to get a professional finish is you need pretty much if you want a consistent result with epoxy resin clear coat, you need to build yourself a rotisserie so it rotates like this, and it needs to rotate for 24 hours,
Yep.
or and it needs to be you need to have about 25 degrees so it cures quick. Otherwise, you're going to be waiting 3 days to cure one coat, and you need humidity below 80%, preferably 50% or over. So
Right.
that's what separates a really good craftsman from ones that sort of like, are still sort of working it out is the clear coat. The hardest thing to do on a lure is a clear coat. So unless you've got those conditions to do it and the tools to do it, it's very, very hard to get a clear coat to look like that, for example. Like if you like that, there's no if you don't rotate it, the epoxy resin doesn't lay straight and it's all in patches. It's not
Yep.
going to put the fish off, but it looks ugly. And if you don't have the right conditions, it could go cloudy. And if you've got oil on your fingers, you get all these little blotches. Yeah, epoxy resin has to be the hardest thing with making lures. Like even now, I pull my hair out sometimes. You know what I mean? I'll tell you a bit of a story. I made a batch of 10 lures, and I was replacing the wheel bearings on my boat. And the wheel bearing cap, I always put a nice bead of silicon over the top. And
Yep.
anyone that knows epoxy resin knows epoxy resin and silicon do not mix. So I had a bit of silicon in my hand. I cleaned my hands, and then I went to grab my lures to sand and then clear coat. Basically had 10 lures just with all crinkles in the clear coat, and they're pulling out my hair going, what happened? And I
Yeah.
failed to remember I'd had silicon on my hands. So
Right.
just simple things like that. So yeah, like I said, but if you're going to make lures for yourself, it doesn't matter if your clear coats don't turn out like perfect. It's only if you want to, start taking the craft to another level is when that clear coat's really, really important. It's not going to affect the fish. Don't care. Like that's the way I look at it. So
Yeah, that makes sense. I was just thinking, just to draw an analogy with something else. Like, say you had to paint a panel of your car. It's not easy. Not that I've tried, but even just using some patch up paint, it never looks right.
nah, it never looks right. And I'm not an artistic person. Everyone's going, geez, some of the things you do, you sure you know? I'm not an artistic person. I think I love doing it that much that I just sort of learned. Um, so yeah, honestly, like I said, my own personal ones are either unpainted or I've got a rattle can and sprayed it white or sprayed it black. So, and my prototypes are always pink, um, or at least pink chin. Like you look at my two prototypes, that's pink and that's got a pink chin. That's only so I can see it when I'm swimming it. Like it's not,
Yeah.
it sounds weird, but that's the reason why they're pink. It's not because the fish like it. It's because I can see it when I'm actually working it and tuning it. So it's pretty. There's always a reason behind things like that. So all my prototypes are like got some sort of pink on it, so I can see it swim.
All right. That was interesting talking about, just creation of lures and, the concepts. It would be obviously very difficult to basically explain every single concept, but I think we basically covered, all the main sticking points of someone that would like to start, choosing materials and some of the challenges and rewards and why people choose certain things and,
Oh,
just some of the things that might draw people in. We've even talked about, the hobby aspect as well,
yeah.
just collection and.
Oh, I'll
But
tell you
I
something,
think the
Shroom.
one thing. Oh yeah, carry on.
I'll tell you something, Shroom. As a lure maker, like you know yourself, when you get a PB fish come to the side of the boat or the bank, you go, wow. You know that buzz you get? When
Yeah,
I get messages when I'm at my day job and people have caught GTs, I was out working all day dealing with what I do at work, and I get photos of these massive fish caught on my stick baits, mate. It's like you've caught the fish yourself and you weren't even there. So
right.
the whole goal with the lure making is just to be fishing every day of the year with my lures in the water somewhere in the world. That's the cool thing about lure making. But so that's the cool thing. But like I'll tell you something, targeting kingfish on stick baits, which we'll start talking about now, is the creme de la crop. Don't think because you live in Sydney that top water fishing isn't for you. It's for the guys up north. Mate, it is so much fun and it is super, super effective at catching trophy fish and rats. So what we'll do is we'll explain how to chase a kingfish, the gear you'd need to chase a kingfish on a stick bait.
Yep,
So it depends on the size of the fish you're chasing, but for me and most other people in Sydney, you want to catch the biggest kingfish you can possibly catch. So something around that 8 to 14k size reel, spin reel, is what you want, and you want to say a PE 5 to 8 rod. So something around that 8 foot mark with a nice bouncy tip is a perfect rod to get you into stick baiting. Okay, if you've got a fair bit of coin and you're one of those guys that want to run high end, something
yep,
like a 14k Saltiga or 14k Stella is ideal. You spool that with a PE6 line. Tas line is a very common one. I like Power Pro. Everyone makes fun of me, but I still use Power Pro.
yep,
Is ideal. And something, say, with something around the 80 to 130 pound leader is where you want. And a couple of rods, if you like high end, something like a ripple fisher around that 8 foot mark, or a yamaga. That's ideal for stick baiting. And if you're budget conscious and you want a high quality rod for stick baiting kingfish in Sydney, you can't go wrong with a Penn Ocean Assassin PE 5 to 8.
Yep.
I've used that rod for a very long time. I've caught some big kingfish on it and some yellowfin up to just shy of 60 kilo on it, and it feels like a Japanese rod. It just says Penn on it.
Right.
If you
Yeah.
want a mid-range reel, instead of buying, look, gone are the days where you need a Stella or a Saltiga. Like, the Penn Slammers and the Saragosas are just as good. Like, they will catch you just as many fish. 14k Saragosa, 8 to 14k Saragosa is perfect.
Yep.
5500 to 6500 Slammer, perfect. You match that up with your PE6 line and 180 to 130 pound leader is perfect. And this sort of outfit is, if you're going to go buy a jig rod, it's always good to buy a stick baiting rod too, because the two coincide with each other. So that's how you'd go gear wise.
Yep.
Areas to start looking. Okay, anywhere where you would chase kingfish. So pressure edges around islands, pressure edges around like pylons in the harbour, islands, even the 100 meter deep reefs out of Sydney. For example, I was jigging kingfish in 120 meters of water. The kingfish were on the surface, and we started throwing stick baits at them, and they were coming up and bashing them. So anywhere you
Yep.
find kingfish, be it on live baits or jigging, you can still actually cast stick baits at them. So the techniques coincide with each other. Generally, if I approach a kingfish spot, for example, let's say I'm casting at a headland. Let's say I'm casting at North Head there in Sydney. First thing I would do is I would cast a stick bait. No follows, then I would leave and move on to another headland and cast again until you get a follow.
Yep.
And if you get a follow and you don't get a bite, a lot of the times you'll get a pack attack and the kingfish will actually follow you to the boat, have your jig rod ready and drop a jig straight into them, and they're on the jig or a live bait. But look, more often than not, if you can tease a kingfish into biting your stick bait, or you're using a high quality handmade stick bait, they will bite. It's just all on the technique you impart.
Yep. And I'd
Yeah.
just like to add that for those that want a little bit more information, there is a podcast that Eric's done with me before on the Shroom Live podcast. Go check that out. It's about kingfish and, what to find them and all sorts of things like techniques, gear. So, yeah, getting back to this.
Yeah. So stick baiting kingfish is pretty much it's the creme de la creme of kingy fishing. It is pretty much at the high. You can't get any higher end in technique. It is the most specialized technique to chase them. It's up there with the most fun, and it's probably the most rewarding. But be prepared for some heartbreaks. Like, I've, for example, I've hooked plenty of fish which would have been well and truly over 15 kilos that found the reef.
Yep.
Um, so you are
Devastating.
sometimes fishing in 8 meters of water sometimes, and sometimes, a lot of the times, part of the reason why I started making lures is you will get plenty of follows and no commits. So topwater kingfish is where it's at, but times a day around a tide change is really, really good. First light and last light is really, really good.
Yep.
Moonrise, moonset is also really, really good. So um, it's one of those things where, if you're pretty comfortable catching kingfish on liveys and you're into the jigging and you're pretty comfortable catching them on jigs now, mate, stick baiting and top water is one of those things where you can add, and it gets even more refined from there, where you can start off casting with a heavier outfit like I described earlier, with a big stick bait, a 200 mil stick bait. If you're
Yep.
getting follows and no bites, you can have a PE3 rod with around a 6 or 5,000 reel with PE3 line, and say a 50 or 60 pound leader with a smaller stick bait around, around that 150 mil. So you sort of don't know what they're going to bite at the time, but if you have a few options to actually cast at them, um, you're gonna have some good success. And another rod outfit that I would suggest having in the boat when you're top water kingfishing is a soft plastic rod. They I'm a lure maker, and I'll tell you straight up, mate, a 9 to 12-inch sluggo, soft plastic, nails them. So
Yep.
you have that as a last resort to throw at them if they're not going to eat anything else. So that's what that's top water kingfishing is just amazing. So if you guys you want to add something to your kingfishing arsenal to really spice things up, you're getting sick of live baiting or down rigging. Even when you're down rigging kingies, right? If there's two of yous, you can have one person on the wheel manning the down rigger, and you can have one person off the front if you have a center console casting stick baits. I always, if I'm live baiting, I always have someone casting a stick bait or a popper, and you'll be surprised how many fish come on that top water lure. So it's another tool to add to your kingfishing arsenal.
Yep.
Yeah.
I was just going to mention here that the camera just cleared up, which is completely odd. You look
No more
much better
technical
now.
difficult. I should have shaved.
Yeah,
I can't
well,
grow facial hair anyway.
hopefully it still looks clear on the rest of the podcast, but
Yeah.
you're coming through loud and clear. Anyway, so that was good. Now,
Yeah.
what about for another species that is close to your
Okay.
heart?
So
the yellowfin tuna.
I'll tell you something. Look, I never really grew up game fishing. I hate trolling, even though I do a fair bit of trolling for tuna. I hate trolling. It's not my ideal method. Stick baiting tuna has to be up there. And look, I've got to say, over the last 2 years with COVID and bad weather, I've missed a lot of trips. Like, I've generally had some pretty bad luck on the yellowfin, but hopefully this season is the saving grace. But my first season chasing yellowfin tuna, I got a few fish over that 50 kilo mark.
Yep.
And I've got one on top water just shy of 60. And I can tell you, like, I'm a I love the physical demands of top water and jigging. It has to be the only fish I've actually shed a tear on the rod. The first fish I caught on top water, first yellowfin I caught on top water, absolutely buried me, and my lower back hurt for about a week. And I went on a fishing
Wow.
trip to the Coral Sea straight afterwards. Um, Yellowfin top water is where it's at, and I'm glad it's actually come into fashion in our neck of the woods, and it's readily available. When I was a kid reading about yellowfin in Fishing World, I never thought in a million years that we could top water 60 to 80 kilo yellowfin out of our home waters here in New South Wales. It was never unheard of, and I think the fishery's always been there, but because top water wasn't cool, it was just game fishing, like trolling around them. But mate, it is such an effective technique for yellowfin, and it's so fun. Like, you can basically go out there, and once you're out on the offshore canyons and you see baitfish souries on the surface, it's like chasing bonito in the harbour from a tinny with metal slugs on steroids. You slowly
Right.
approach a school, and you cast a stick bait, and if your stick bait is the right size, you don't even have to work it. As soon as it hits the water, you'll get a yellowfin come out and just nail it. Like, and you'll see it get fully airborne with this thing in its mouth, and you've got the hooks in it. It's incredible, and the power through a top water rod with heavy drag, it's unbelievable. Like, when that initial hit, it feels like you're water skiing across the deck of the boat. And so it's definitely where it's at, and it's really come into fashion over the last couple of years. Everyone seems to be doing it now. So for me, the way I look for yellowfin, so I'll just give you a bit of a rundown. I wouldn't go yellowfin fishing without a subscription to Rip Charts. So I'm basically looking for upwellings and the zero line on Rip Charts and the right water temperature. Generally, from about, say, late February to about October, you'll have a shot at yellowfin, depending on where that eddy and upwelling is up and down the coast. So once you've found an area, Rip Charts is another podcast in itself, but once you've found an area on Rip Charts where you want to go, you basically get yourself a mark from Rip Charts where you go, yep, there's an upwelling there, there's a temperature break, there's chlorophyll, which is going to hold bait. You put that mark into your GPS, and it's just basically a gamble. You go out there and look for signs of tuna.
Yep.
It could be anywhere from 40 to 100 Ks out. So I do that in my 4.5 meter Haines. I know that's crazy, but
That
that's
is,
what I had it built for. And yeah, once you're out there, you're looking for the sign. The biggest thing for me is birds, and specifically gannets. The second is bait. So generally, if you find gannets and you find souries or flying fish on the surface, the yellowfin aren't too far away. I generally prospect with two lures behind the boat, just two. A lot of people use those Profigis, but because they're a mad lure, I've used them on game boats and stuff, but
Yep.
they seem to tangle everything on my little boat. So I just run two hard bodies. So two Halco Laser Pros behind the back
Yep.
on 24 kilo. And I basically troll around until I find that bait. Um, if I find tuna busting up on the surface, those two lures come back in and all I do is cast at them. So I don't run the traditional game fishing spread of 5 lures. I purely only run two lures to find them. And once I find them, be it fish on the surface or the right sign,
Yep.
I cast lures in that area and just do big drifts on that bait schools and you stay on the bait. And if you're in the right area, the hits from yellowfin are just absolutely tremendous. And the pain that they put you in are probably like nothing hurts more than fighting a yellowfin for 20 plus minutes on PE 6 to 8 tackle on a long rod with no harness, just a gimbal.
Yeah.
So
Nice.
it really is incredible. And once you hook up, it's very important. Tuna always do circles. So you use your boat to follow the circle. And as the fight concludes, the circles get smaller. And once the circle gets smaller, then it's time for the gaff. But I haven't seen a yellowfin fight go more than say half an hour on a top water rod. I don't
Yep.
know what it is with the braid. It seems to knock them over a lot quicker. Like the fights I've done on 24 kilo tackle can be like on game gear can be up to 2 hours. It's the constant like sort of bounce in the mono. I don't know. I can't explain why I knock them over quicker on braid.
Yep.
It's one of those things. But look, one thing I'll say about yellowfin, I see a lot of people use trebles. I have had some heartbreaking moments running my stick, like catching yellowfin with trebles. They do tend to pull out. So I generally rig my stick baits to be on singles, either inline singles, or
Yep.
I'm going to give these a whirl this season, which are a little assist rigs.
Right.
So once a single hooks in, it's not going to pull out. Where a treble, you could have it just works on itself to open up the treble or pull out. So that's one thing I did when I was designing my stick bait. It was very important that they swam with singles for that particular reason for yellowfin. Kingies, Kingies have got the right jaw for trebles. Trebles are okay for kingies. They don't seem to pull out because of the hard draw of the kingy. But
Yep.
yeah, with yellowfin, they seem to really pull. Like I tend to. I don't know if it's just me, but I tend to pull a lot of fish with trebles. Um, so the singles are a really important thing. And I've noticed too, if I run trebles, a lot of the time that the tuna are actually like hooked on the side of the face, not in the mouth. So you're fighting a 50 to 80 kilo fish, dragging them sideways, which isn't an easy fight.
No,
So
that wouldn't be.
yeah, but yeah, when you find fish busting on the surface, it's very important not to run straight over them. As soon as you see them, slow the boat down and edge yourself into casting distance and try and get ahead of the fish. So try and get on the downward side current of them because they're going to be constantly moving. Sometimes you can't actually catch the busting yellowfin; they're moving that fast. And obviously, it's a fuel consumption issue too. If you're really giving it to your boat out there, you need to know that you got enough fuel to get back 50
Yep.
or 60 k's back to the boat ramp. So
Yep.
yeah,
You can sort of
sometimes you just
forget if you're
yeah
chasing bus stops out there.
sometimes you just can't actually catch them. So that's one thing. And I found when I've had success with topwater yellowfin, it seems to be more of an afternoon bite. I don't know what it is, but yeah, the morning you might get one or two fish trolling, but it seems to be that sort of from 2 to 4 o'clock. I don't know
Oh,
what
that's
it,
interesting.
mate. It always seems to be really productive time for topwater yellowfin.
Yep.
And look, a couple of seasons ago, we were only getting them over the edge of the shelf. Like I'm talking within 30 k's of shore sometimes.
That is
So
very close.
look, I tend to look. I've only got a 4.5 meter Haines, like I said. So I'm not one. You won't see me out at Heaton's Hill off Sydney. Like that's just way too far.
Yep.
you will see me off Nora Canyons sometimes. That's a big few canyon system out of Swansea there.
Yep.
And yeah, look, that is a close to 100 k's or 90 k's out there and 90 k's back. That's a big
That's
day. I've done that a
daring.
couple times. I've been out there twice in my boat, so that's a bit of a. But the,
That is,
the fishing's incredible.
yeah,
But you just need to get so many things right to get out there. You need the weather, you need the wind, and you need the fish to be there. So I'm keen to see where the actual like the upwellings actually form up this year. Last year, like they had this incredible bite off Bateman's, and I went there the day after, and the wind just absolutely blew up, and I was stuck offshore in at 25 knots southerly, and I was 60 k's offshore. So that was a fun ride with waves hitting me in the face on the way back to the ramp.
yeah.
So yeah, I
I don't
had
know
some
how you do
terrible.
it. 100 k's out
Yeah, it's look,
gets rough in the afternoon as well.
I've
Sounds
got to
like
say, yeah,
you're out there in the afternoon.
in winter it isn't too bad. Um, look, admittedly, look, in winter it isn't too bad. Like the weather's pretty consistent. It's not like summer where you get those bad nor'easterlies in the afternoon. But you, like I said, you really do need glass out weather to go out there in my boat.
Yeah,
I don't go if it's 2 meters of sea and 15 knots. You won't see me out there. I'll go chase kingies or something. You know what I mean?
yeah,
Or if it's that bad, you going offshore is dangerous enough. Going that far offshore, you really need all your safety equipment. Like you should have it anyway, but like the biggest thing out there is your engine reliability. You should be like get yourself a good marine mechanic and make sure he services your boat regularly every 100 hours or every year. Um, and you got to make sure you got enough fuel. You should know like if the fuel consumption of your boat. Like even though I've only got 100 litres of fuel under my floor, I've actually never used more than 120 litres out tuna fishing.
yeah,
So I always take backup fuel and I always drive my boat accordingly. So I know how many litres per hour I'm burning and that sort of stuff. I'm cruising on 15 litres per hour. So if it takes me 2 hours to get there, it's only 30 litres of fuel. So I know it's going to be 60 litres of fuel in travel, and then I've got 40 to, however many jerry cans I've got to actually calculate my fishing.
yeah.
So you really do need to know the fuel consumption of your boat to do that safely.
Sounds good, Eric. I think this is a very interesting podcast, and
Yeah,
for someone like me that hasn't understood anything about lure making, it's very interesting and insightful. Just some of the concepts that someone like you would have to go through to design and then make, which takes a lot of trial and error, and some of the other aspects of it, such as, the rewards, like you said, people sending in those photos and it's like you're
yeah.
actually fishing itself. That's something I've never realized. It's interesting to see that
Oh, mate, I'm
point of
telling you,
view.
Shroom, it's my drug of choice, mate. Like it's an addictive drug, mate. Seeing people catch trophy fish on your lures,
Yeah,
and like, dude, I'm just a guy from back of Western Sydney. You know what I mean? Like, and there's people around Australia casting my lures. It's insane. So yeah, that I need a good yellowfin fit like yellowfin season to get me lures in front of them. Like it's funny, I designed them specifically for kingfish, which they've caught, and yellowfin, which they haven't caught. So, um, and it's not that they wouldn't catch a yellowfin; they just haven't been cast at one yet.
yeah, no, that's fair enough. Everyone's got their aspirations, and
Yeah.
there's always certain things that we want to achieve.
Oh.
2023 might be the year.
Remember that time I said I couldn't catch a dogtooth tuna? It happened. You know what I mean? It's
Yeah,
one of those things. So I'm still adamant they're the hardest fish to land on the planet. Like I think they're on the that's on the list. Like look, I've done a bit of GT fishing. Like I've been with Jason Legg up at Topwater Sports Fishing Charters out of Cairns. It was a black marlin trip, but with a
yeah,
bit of GT fishing in there. And like put it this way, look, I'm not going to mention the other two lures that were cast in front of me, but like I was the youngest guy on the trip, so the two older fellas were casting ahead of me, peppering the unpeppered water, and I was just casting at the bommies that they'd already cast on, and to see GTs come out from under a bommie and swim past two commercially available timber lures to eat mine that I was casting,
yeah.
like man, like you just go, man, what did I do to this thing to actually for it to do that? But it just comes down to, man, it's a pressured fishery. They've seen all those lures before. They haven't seen one of mine.
Yep.
And even if they've seen one of mine, they haven't seen that particular one because no two are the same.
Yeah.
So it is one of those things. Look, for me, GT fishing is unreal. Like, it's really refreshing to have a fish like that just come out and belt a lure. Like, it's so different from what I'm used to with kingies. Like, kingies, you just they come up. You get about 10 no's before you get a yes, and for them just to come out and just, like, GTs, there's no question. They just come out and bash it.
Yep.
You just think, man, I wish I had these things in Sydney. They, like, honestly, they are a gangster of a fish.
Yep.
I wouldn't say they fight as hard as a kingy. I know that's going to be an out there comment, but yeah, in terms of just the strike on a top water lure, they probably hit the hardest, I've got to say. Kingies
Right.
are more of a slurp. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah. And yellowfin are pretty mad though. Like, it's a mixed bag with yellowfin. Some of them slurp it, and some of them get fully airborne with your lure T-boned in their mouth.
Yeah, that's the
So,
best site.
yeah.
How can people get in contact with you?
Oh, mate, hit me up on my new Instagram. Unfortunately, or I don't know what happened to my last Instagram page, but Fishstetic. I can't have Fishstetics anymore. Fishstetic on Instagram is the easiest way to get me.
Yeah. How do you spell it?
Fishstetic. Jeez,
Yeah.
it's weird. It's hard to actually say things aloud. I
I'll
can
also
write it
put
every
it
day.
in the description of the video as well. And is there anyone you'd like to shout out or thank?
Mate, I just want to say, mate, there is some really good things coming out of Sydney these days. Lure making wise, want to say I'm going to give a shout out to a few really good Australian lure makers that not a lot of people know of, and you can have a look at them on Instagram. Mate, number one, if you want to see an artistic lure that swims really, really good, mate, they are really one of a kind. Check out Itchy Fingers on Instagram, mate.
Yep.
They have to be the coolest things I've ever seen, like in the garage lure making scene, mate. Hit up Dave. He's mate. He have a look at what he makes. Itchy Fingers. Um, another guy I'd want to give a shout out, if you like GT fishing, like GT fishing, hit up Jason from Top Water Sports Fishing Charters. If you want to catch yourself a GT, mate, he's your man. Like, his boat's immaculate. Like,
Yep.
everything's so clean, and the guy can find his fish. He's really, really good. And mate, I want to give a shout out to Release Outfitters, mate. Matt from Sydney Boat Screens has taken over Release Outfitters, and he's a good dude. So I reckon give him a bit of a hit up if you need a new boat screen, or if you want some fishing tackles. So he's starting to sell a bit of fishing gear. So hit him up.
Awesome. Well, thanks for your time, Eric Brandao. And ladies and gents, hope you guys enjoyed this very chill, informative podcast about lure making concepts and even a little bit about kingfish and yellowfin tuna as well. Yeah, so for the moment, ladies and gents, this is the Shroom on the Shroom Live podcast, signing out.